guest today is Nicolai Chen Nielsen. He's an associate partner at McKinsey and author of Return on Ambition. Nicolai, welcome to our show today.
Thank you for having me, Christopher.
Let's rewind a little bit. As a kid, when did you have this awareness that you might have been a bit of an ambitious person?
Yeah, I mean, ambition is something that's filled my life, I think, from a very early stage. Deep inside, I've always known I've wanted to do something great, something different, something you could say groundbreaking. And I would think back to the first memories when I was really a kid, around 5 years old, perhaps, where I was driven to be a professional football or soccer player. And that filled my life. I remember just playing all the time. I remember going to a summer camp where we played 5 days a week for 8 hours a day. You know, it was just nonstop, end-to-end football every day.
Wait. Did you just say that you went to a camp for 8 hours when you're 5-year-old?
Yeah, we played. We played the whole summer.
And where was this?
This was in Denmark. We had just moved back to Denmark, yeah.
So one of the qualities I see when I interview people like Elon Musk or Buzz Aldrin, who's an astronaut, they all have this insane intensity. Or even Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos was interviewed one time. He went to school in the Montessori system, and he said that the teachers told his mom that, you know what, your son Jeff is so focused in whatever he's doing, they literally had to move him physically with the desk to another spot to do some other task. And it sounds like you have that level of ambition. And I'm curious, I mean, you say that you're passionate about it, but I mean, when I was 5, I can't even remember that. But I want to kind of understand. So you're 5 years old, you're in this camp, you love it because you're just passionate about soccer? Or, I mean, did your parents influence you? Because most 5-year-olds, they want to just run around, but you're saying like you have to be more intentional. And that's a lot of time. I mean, it's one thing to do it for like an hour even. Yeah. But for 8 hours, do you remember any moments where the coaches taught you things to start channeling that energy? Because later on in life, I'm sure you did some other things with that energy. But for now, just let's hone in on that point. Like, what do you feel you learned at that age to really start harnessing that ambition in yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a very single-purposed, single-focused livelihood, if you will. I remember it's almost like the racehorses that have the blinders. You're really going towards the goal. The goal for me being becoming the world's best soccer player. It was just so clear. I had all my idols, Ronaldo and so forth. I wanted to become the world's best. And I don't recall any pressure. It wasn't because my parents said you must become. On the contrary, they wanted me to have a more well-rounded, balanced upbringing. But it was just a very strong conviction. I knew that's what I wanted to go towards. And every day I kind of woke up thinking about soccer and how I could get better and channeling that energy. Coaches, of course, supported me along the way.
And what are some things you feel you learned as a kid? Because so much of our lives foundationally comes from our coaches, our mentors, our parents. So are there any lessons that they taught you early on that really stick with you now?
Yeah, absolutely. There are many gifts, I think, of pursuing something very intensely, whether you end up making it or not. I learned, for example, hard work, perseverance. I learned a great deal around peak performance, and both mentally, physically, how you can hone yourself for competition, how you can rest. So everything around that intensity, hard work, diligence was something I learned. I was living it day to day, and I think I've brought that gift with me even today.
But do you even remember like what they did for 8 hours? Because there's a lot of time to like hit a ball around.
When you ask what I remember, it was fun, to be honest. It was fun in games. Even as it became more serious, it was very much this honing of kind of the older I got by 11, 12, definitely by teenager, then it's serious. You're in kind of the youth leagues and you're playing with a very clear goal to the next youth league. So it's a very natural funneling, but even at the most intense moments, it was fun. I mean, to answer your question, we're working on drills, techniques. How do you pass the ball? How do you cross it better? How do you control it? How do you pivot? We were learning tactics of, in this type of play, how should you think about positioning yourself? So it's just as much the mind as the technique. But even all that diligence and hard work, it was fun. I remember it as being fun.
That's great. So how do you feel you went from that intensity to pivoting more toward the business world?
Yeah, it was definitely a big pivot. For those of you who know me, I'm not a professional soccer player today. I did have a bit of a rude awakening or a moment where I ultimately had to choose not to pursue the route of soccer. I remember it very clearly. I was 19, and I had to make that decision.
Well, tell me about it. I mean, I think prior to this interview, you talked about this experience where you're on your treadmill and you're running around. I mean, what's that? Because it's important that we have a self-awareness.
Yeah.
Let's say with Leonardo DiCaprio, I'm writing a new book now, and it's about story-based leadership, how innovators like Steve Jobs create global brands through storytelling. And one of the stories about Leonardo DiCaprio, people don't know this, the guy literally had a prostitution ring in his alleyway. He had drug dealers, and he was actually robbed when he was 5. He got rejected hundreds of times. It took him 2 years to get an agent. But when he started getting more gigs, he had this self-awareness that, okay, instead of just trying for every single role, he started being more self-aware of what roles to take. And one of the roles was with Robert De Niro in This Boy's Life. And then a few years later, he ended up with Titanic. But my point is, Leonardo, like you, have this sense of self-awareness. So at that pivotal moment, tell me more about the fact, okay, you're so focused on soccer. But then all of a sudden, this self-awareness, walk us through that mind process.
Yeah, absolutely. It was almost like the blinders, opened up. I was so driven, and I remember vividly. I just turned 19. I was on a treadmill on vacation, keeping up my cardio. I was running roughly 3 miles, and I had a pain in my hip, and I had injuries before. And I just remember that moment thinking, if I can't even run 3 miles to stay in shape, how on earth am I going to become a professional soccer player? And that's when I literally made the decision not to pursue that path. And it was such a big moment because I think I had not seen the signs coming, or I had chosen to ignore them. And in the last couple of years, I was good, but never great. And I think I had very subconsciously pushed that aside, still hoping that I would become what I had hoped to become. And it was only at that moment where I just said, you know what, this is not path I'm going to take. This is not going to get me to greatness. I'm never going to be as good as I'd hoped for. And then I ultimately decided not to pursue it.
And how do you go from literally this intensity in soccer to at one of the best companies in the world, including going to schools like Copenhagen business schools? So literally, I don't know if people realize McKinsey really is like the gold standard of the consultant work. So not everyone can just go there. So how do you go from I'm disappointed to now working at one of the top consulting firm in the world? Like, to walk us through that process so our listeners can really learn from your understanding of ambition.
Yeah, absolutely. I channeled that ambition someplace different. I was always going to go to university. I'd signed up from when I was 19, and it was just a question of, was this going to be the primary focus, or was soccer going to be the primary focus? So I joined university, and then I just really went all in there. I didn't know what I wanted to become. So for me, it was always a question of the direction, but not the destination. I knew the direction I wanted to go. I knew the importance of diligence. The exact direction, actually, at that point, I didn't know. Is it going to be within global governance? Is it going to be consulting, banking, corporate entrepreneurship? I wasn't quite sure, but I very much channeled the energy there. I remember at university in Europe, it's a 5 years master's. You take 3 years undergrad and then 2-year grad school. I remember doing 7 years worth of courses in those 5 years, which no one obviously asked me to do. It was for no better reason than just intellectual curiosity and wanting to do that. 7 seemed to appeal to me. Ended up getting a double master's degree, filling all the courses, working part-time for the vast majority. I was fortunate to go to Wharton on exchange, went to HEC in Paris. So all these things kind of went together. I think that, again, the direction was there, and then the exact manifestation wasn't planned out, but I knew where I wanted to go.
Talk to us about your book and how it came about.
Yeah, I think it was, I was actually writing 2 books at McKinsey for many, many years. I was ambitious. I was writing one book called Leadership at Scale. Leadership at Scale got published in 2018. Concurrently, I was writing Return on Ambition. And of course, concurrently, I was serving clients and working full time. Return on Ambition came
Let's
from
talk about the Leadership on Scale came first.
Leadership at Scale. Yep. Leadership at Scale was published with McKinsey. So it was myself and 2 senior partners, and we published that book in 2018.
Well, let's talk about that first, and then we'll talk about the Return on Ambition. So talk to us about, what does that even mean? Like leadership and scale.
Leadership at Scale. What we find is that a large number of companies need more and better leadership, right? They self-assess themselves as saying, we need better leaders, we need more leaders, the world is changing very quickly. What they also say and what we find is that many leadership development programs don't actually build the right leaders, the right quality, they don't meet the intended impact. It's kind of this double whammy of we need more, we can't build them. So what we set out to do was crack the code of how to develop leaders. And we call it leadership at scale because if you want to transform the leadership of a company, 50,000 person company, 100,000 person company, Fortune 100, it's not about the top 10, 15, even the top 100. They're important, but you have to get it across the full entire organization in a deliberate way to transform. It's about reaching that tipping point of how do we lead. When does the new leadership style you'd say take over and become part of the new company?
So how does someone scale the leadership? Because let's say it's one thing to have 10 employees, but do you actually use case studies of people you helped? I mean, in terms of helping them become better leaders?
For leadership at scale?
Yeah.
Yeah, we look very much at the organizational level. So we focus very much less on the individual. We talk a little bit about what it means to be a good leader, but we look at it at an organizational level, almost from a CEO perspective, saying this organization have a certain strategy. What is the leadership required to execute on that strategy? It's a strategy-backed approach, and different types of companies, different types of goals, objectives require different styles of leadership, whether it's growth into new markets or innovation or turnaround or financial management. They're very, very different as strategic goals. So to answer your question, we look at what is the leadership required for that company, and then very practically, how do you build that across tens of thousands of people in a sustainable way?
And what's one thing you found that all companies that have leadership that's through that scale, any through lines or commonalities that you saw?
Some of the research pointed towards problem solving, and especially complex problem solving. I think companies and leaders and entrepreneurs today are more and more faced with unknown unknowns and then known unknowns, and they're looking at situations that they haven't been taught how to deal with. Business school is not going to tell you how to deal with every single case and scenario. So I think that ability to just take a step back, understand what are we really dealing with, what is really going to make a difference here, and then you could say cracking it, solving, structuring that problem is incredibly important. So I find more and more companies are building that muscle of more complex conceptual problem solving.
Yeah, and it's needed now more than ever. I mean, our world is so global. So writing that first book, did that give you a little taste of the writing world? So he's like, you know what, Christopher, I'm going to write another book now.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't a path that I thought I would go into. In high school, college, English lit writing was interesting, but it wasn't like my passion. But it was interesting how I found that the ability to be creative in a more knowledge-based way really appealed to me. So I enjoyed the writing. I enjoyed getting up early or having late nights of actually putting pen to paper. And it definitely gave me that appetite to do a second book very shortly after.
And tell us this return on ambition now. This is the current book you have now. What inspired you to write about that specific subject?
Return on Ambition, I feel, is an important book. I definitely have lived ambition. I've lived the gifts and strengths of ambition. I've experienced the pitfalls, the negative aspects of ambition. And interestingly, when I talk to peers, colleagues, friends, family members, first of all, many people do feel that they are ambitious to some extent. And second of all, the vast majority struggle with their ambition. They struggle with getting the most out of it. They doubt whether the hard work is really worth it in the long run. They're struggling to balance so many different things at the same time. So I felt a need to look into the topic more deeply and see how I could help a broader audience through a book.
Yeah. No, again, when I first saw the title, I'm like, wow, that's a very unique title. And with ambition, it's such a broad statement, but when you said about some of the pitfalls, everyone knows that, okay, if you're ambitious, you can get the money, the girl, the guy, the yacht, whatever it might be, right? But what are some of the pitfalls you mentioned that you want to perhaps help people not go through?
Great question. I think about 7 frenemies, 7 pitfalls, and they're both a friend and an enemy. They're both a strength and a gift. So it's important when people think about their ambition, not to label it as bad or to say this intensity is not helping me and I should get rid of it. It's more about harnessing it in a much more deliberate way. So the frenemies, to give you a few examples, one of them is independence. One of them is competitiveness. One of them is perseverance. All of these are very important gifts of entrepreneurs and business people to do what they need to do. But the problem is when they become too much, when your ambition starts to manage you instead of you managing ambitions. So I'll give you an example. Independence. We interviewed Sanford Biggers, a very creative and wonderful artist based out of Harlem. And he had a mindset around independence without having put that label on it. But he had a vision where every piece of art that came out of his workshop had to be done by him. Every little brushstroke, even the email that came out of the workshop had to be sent by him. And he quickly realized that was limiting him in both scale and speed, but also quality. He wasn't really learning from others. And it took him some years of reflection and a process to actually realize he's stronger with others. And he has harnessed this ability to work with many different artists to get to much more innovative creations and sculptures.
Yeah. It almost, as you're talking, Nicolai, it's like ambition is like OCD, because it's this obsessive compulsive, I wouldn't call it disorder. I call it an actual alignment, frankly, because anytime they study flow, whether you're an athlete like Kobe Bryant or you and McKinsey or me as a keynote speaker, I really don't think about how much time I spend writing a book or giving a speech, because it's just that beauty of timelessness. And for you, when you're studying these various people in your book, I'm curious, how did you even pick the people that you chose to study in your book?
Yeah, it's a great question. I looked at ambition quite broadly, to your point, like OCD. I put the labels: a strong yearning and drive for a future state. Right? You have that yearning, you have that drive. The state has to be different. It's not just about I'm going to get up and do the same thing, but something that's really challenging to get to. And when you look at people who've done phenomenal things in their life, even the less well-known ones, they all share very similar mindsets, very similar behaviors, very similar frenemies to get to that, quite crazy goal in some cases.
Yeah. So for you, I mean, we talked about how sometimes you profiled artists, sometimes you profiled entrepreneurs. So it's more of a gamut. So some books focus only on entrepreneurship or only executive, but you're like, no, anyone who's ambitious across the board. So did you send out a survey, or you just called up your partners? I mean, how'd you go about, because there's so many ambitious people. So wasn't it more geared toward your interests, or you wanted to have a perspective that maybe you wouldn't ever think about, but you chose to profile them? So like, what are some other examples, for instance, of the people you profiled?
Yeah, I wanted a broad perspective because the research confirmed that people really share similar traits and behaviors. So we looked at Elon Musk and his ability to just work so hard and keep pushing himself. We looked at Amelia Boone, who is works at Apple and a triathlete, and she's been winning numerous competitions with endurance, and she had to go through injuries. We looked at Ariana Huffington. We looked at Jeff Weiner.
All right, let's focus on Elon and Emily, because again, I don't want our listeners to really, so what do you feel you learned from Elon? Because everyone loves Elon. I'll share a little story about Elon when I interviewed him, but like, tell us what you feel that you learned from Elon and that your listeners and your readers will learn from your book about Elon.
No, absolutely. Elon Musk and Amelia actually share the same, we profiled them with the frenemy around perseverance. And for both of them, they've both understood what was the challenge, and they've actually managed to also pivot, you will, and become more intentional. So both of them, let's take Elon. He works hard. He's super ambitious. He's running multiple companies at the same time, and he keeps launching new ones. And the companies aren't just, the daily bread and butter stuff. I mean, they're like pushing the frontiers of space exploration and electric cars and very, very bold spaces. He talks openly about how, yes, it was good that he could push himself and persevere and work hard. He also talks openly about how it sometimes got in his own way, and he's had to learn how to balance. He's had to learn how to take rest, all in the spirit of helping him reach his ambitions even faster and better. But I think he brings a lesson around more is not always better, and we are all human at the end of the day, and being more intentional about how you spend your time is extremely important.
Yeah, I was reading a story about how one of his mentors when he was in Canada, his name is Pete Nielsen. He was a banker at Nova Scotia. Pete's daughter ended up meeting Elon. This is like when he was late teens, early 20s in Canada. And Christy was her name, the daughter of this banking executive, said, I remember that Elon was very unique in that he literally said to her, if I didn't have to eat and just work, I would just work. But going back to your point where ambition is so obsessive that you're hopefully encouraging people to, like, you can have the ambition like Elon, but know that you have to eat. And that was a question he asked. And he's And then when I interviewed him, people often say, oh, he works 100 hours a week. And I asked him, hey, Elon, do you actually work 100-hour weeks? And he said, 80 to 90, you know, but still 80 to 90 is a lot of work. Now, going back to the other person, Emily, talk to us more about her, because I've never heard about her. So tell us a little bit about her in case our listeners or viewers don't know about her.
Yeah, she's won multiple what's called a Tough Mudder competitions and some of these endurance races where they both the terrain is very difficult, but they're also extremely long. So you have to build that endurance. And she was very successful. She kept pushing herself, and she, of course, got injured a few times. But there was one injury where when she came back, she was on crutches because she had a small break in one of her bones. And in her mind, she said, of course, the more I can train, the better. The quicker I can get back, the better. So she started to train on her crutches, or one leg was on a crutch, one was not. And all was well until she then actually got off the crutches, went back to training, and then she got a significantly worse injury. And the reason was when you're training on one crutch, you build the imbalances in your back, and she ended up breaking or having a crack in one of the femur muscles. And that was also a wake-up call when she was telling about how she was crying and she felt so much pressure to come back, and she realized that it was all self-defeating. And this is just one, I think, great, sad, but ultimately a positive story when you think about how she learned from that experience and how she shares the story to help other people also learn. What is really driving your ambition? Is it always you, or is it the ambition kind of taking hold? And how can you reflect on it and be more intentional so that at the end of the day, you're happy and fulfilled and not doing something just because you feel like you have to?
No, that's a great point. Now, what did she do at Apple? I mean, you talked about what she did as this triathlon, but what did she actually do at Apple that she's known for?
I believe she's a corporate lawyer. I'm not 100% sure. We didn't focus much on that, but the significance of that is that as a full-time, I think, attorney at Apple, she's still training with 100 miles a week. She's getting up in the morning. Like, it's really, really quite fascinating how she manages that.
That's like her side gig. That's why, like, just going to Apple, just like working at McKinsey already is like it's very hard to do. And you're sharing the story about her. Like, I don't know. I can't even rehash what you said, because it's like, I'm like, well, again, I know what I'm good at, Nicolai. I'm not a sports guy. I remember one of my members in high school, I was running around the track. It was like a 440 at the time. And I was really trying my best. Like, you started at 5, I was probably 14. I'm like, oh, maybe I'll do track and field. And I did it one time, and I was hyperventilating. I ran the whole thing. I just fell down, just collapsed. I could barely breathe. And yet I was the last guy. So I knew personally, I'm not a very athletic guy. I like exercising, but as you start talking about these stories, I'm like almost getting traumatized. Not really, but I'm like, whoa. But just knowing what your ambition is about. Because if you ask me about speaking or traveling or writing, I'm like, I'll just dive in deep and I won't care about anything, right? So
totally.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, you know where you want to go.
Yeah. So it's really cool. So one more story that you feel you relate to in your book, because ultimately life is about having different teachers. And they often say about how you read the book that you are ready to read, or your teacher appears when you're ready to be the student. So I'm curious, what's one story that you can share that really captures your book succinctly? Because return on ambition means you have this ambition, you might want to return. A lot of people think that they want this return, like, I'm going to work like crazy, but then they end up breaking their bodies or whatever. But you have this awareness. I'm curious, what's one story you can leave us with that kind of captures you, your book, and what you hope your readers gain from you and your book?
Absolutely. One story I might bring up, Anish Shah, who we also interviewed in New York. He was a consultant at McKinsey for many years, went to Ivy League and was very successful, launched a startup, while at business school. He is now a stand-up comedian and very successful at that. And he talks a lot about this, the pitfall of convention, right? You feel like there are certain boxes you need to check. And he had the blinders that I probably had when I was a young soccer player. He had the blinders of being a CEO. He talked about as a kid watching Wall Street with Gordon Gekko. He wanted to be the good version of Gordon Gekko. And that was his blinders. He said he was always in a bit of a box, and he was good at it. I mean, he went to Ivy League, he got into McKinsey, he was checking all the right boxes, but he ultimately realized that he wasn't happy. And we talk a bit about false ambitions that aren't really true to you. And I think I would love to leave the readers with the importance of self-reflection. I think we live in a world that's very busy. It's important. It's easy to be on 24/7, and it's also relatively easy to be distracted by what's really personally meaningful. So Anish is a story of someone who ended up leaving McKinsey, which is hard to do, and then pursuing a stand-up comedy career when he wasn't well known. It was very much a leap of faith, but he says there's no place he'd rather be. He's very happy he did it, but it was hard to do. It's not as easy as saying, I'm just going to leave my corporate job, or I'm going to stop being an entrepreneur, I'm going to start being an entrepreneur. You really have to connect with what is your purpose in life ultimately.
Nicolai, that's a perfect way to end our show, because I used to do yoga many years ago. And they always say, you do yoga. I did this thing called Bikram yoga, and it's like super hot. I was like super hot. Arrogant. I'm like, oh, this is so easy. A minute in, I was like sweating like crazy. And it's like tough to do these, I think, 26 poses. And by the end of it, I'm like spent. But they always say, look, after you've had this intensity, you have to relax. You have to lie down. Don't just leave. But it's so perfect of an analogy where, as ambitious people, you can keep go. But we're human beings. We're not machines. And just like in yoga, it's about namaste. In life, as you're saying, the self-awareness, our brains need that sense of namaste to really have that sense of reflection. So that's a perfect way to end this episode, Nicolai. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.